The streets of Queens, New York, in the early 1990s were alive with a rhythm all their own, a mix of restless energy and quiet menace. The neighborhoods hummed with the distant wail of sirens, the occasional bark of a dog, and the faint murmur of late-night conversations drifting from stoops and corner stores. Streetlights flickered over cracked sidewalks, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night, as if the city itself was holding its breath. It was in these shadowed streets that Supreme McGriff began to carve his name into the underworld, a figure whose reputation would soon eclipse the boundaries of Queens and ripple through the criminal networks of New York. Known to some as the Emperor of Queens, his presence was subtle but unmistakable, a quiet force of influence and fear that demanded attention even in his absence. McGriff's story was not one of sudden notoriety or sensational headlines alone, it was a slow, deliberate rise, shaped by circumstance, ambition, and the unforgiving streets he called home. Queens, a borough of stark contrasts, held pockets of affluence and ambition side by side with neighborhoods struggling under economic hardship. In the shadow of the highways and the bustling marketplaces, young men like McGriff learned early that respect could be as valuable as currency, that loyalty and reputation were the currencies of survival. To walk these streets was to learn the language of power, the subtle negotiations that took place in whispered conversations, coded glances, and calculated gestures. Every interaction carried weight, and for those who understood, the streets themselves became a school, a place where lessons were unforgiving and stakes were always high. It was this environment that shaped McGriff's early understanding of human behavior, his awareness of opportunity, and his growing sense of ambition. He moved through these streets not merely as a participant in their rhythm but as an observer, quietly absorbing the dynamics around him. Friends and allies could be as fleeting as the shadows, and rivals could appear where least expected. Even as a young man, McGriff exhibited a calm intelligence that set him apart. He noticed patterns, the subtle hierarchies within groups, and the way influence was wielded quietly, almost imperceptibly, until it became undeniable. In many ways, he was learning the art of empire building in its most primal form, control without chaos, power without unnecessary exposure, influence without overt violence, though he would not shy away from force when it was required. By the early 1990s, McGriff had already begun to emerge as a figure of significance. The whispers on the streets of Queens spoke of his growing operations, the efficiency of his crew, and the way he could move goods and money through the borough with near imperceptible precision. Unlike the brash figures of organized crime often depicted in sensational media, McGriff's style was measured and calculated. There was an almost imperceptible elegance in the way he conducted himself, a quiet authority that demanded respect without the need for spectacle. Those who underestimated him quickly learned that beneath the calm demeanor lay a sharp mind, capable of orchestrating complex operations and navigating the treacherous waters of loyalty, betrayal, and ambition. Yet, despite the growing notoriety, McGriff was not a myth, he was very much a man molded by his environment. The streets of Queens were unforgiving, and survival demanded resilience, cunning, and adaptability. He understood that to dominate in such a landscape, one had to be both feared and respected, to maintain a delicate balance between intimidation and loyalty. This duality would define much of his rise, as he learned to project power without appearing reckless, to command attention without drawing unnecessary scrutiny. His influence extended beyond the streets to the social fabric of Queens itself, affecting lives in ways both subtle and profound. Communities felt his presence indirectly, through the shifts in local dynamics, through the protective alliances he forged, and through the quiet caution that his name inspired. The title, Emperor of Queens, did not arrive overnight. It was a culmination of years of careful strategy, an unspoken acknowledgement of his dominion over a realm defined by shadows and secrecy. In the minds of those who navigated the same streets, the moniker carried weight, conjuring images of a ruler who did not need a throne to exert authority. McGriff's empire was built not merely on fear but on respect, a recognition that he understood the rules of the game more fully than most. Those who worked with him knew the value of discretion, those who opposed him learned quickly that miscalculation could be costly. In this way, his power was both visible and invisible, an omnipresent influence felt in hushed tones and careful glances, rather than in overt displays of violence. Even as the world beyond Queens moved forward with the mundane rhythm of daily life, McGriff's presence cast a quiet shadow over the borough. Markets, corner shops, and residential blocks carried the imprint of his influence, often unseen but palpably present. Life in Queens continued, with the ordinary blending seamlessly with the extraordinary, as McGriff's empire expanded through calculated moves, strategic alliances, and a keen understanding of human nature. It was a world where loyalty was precious, where betrayal could emerge from the most trusted quarters, and where the line between friend and foe was drawn with subtle precision. For listeners, this opening chapter of McGriff's life serves as both an invitation and a warning, a gentle immersion into a landscape where power is quiet, presence is subtle, and history is written in the shadows. As night descended over Queens, the streets seemed to exhale, settling into a rhythm that mirrored the calculated pace of McGriff himself. The quiet tension, the interplay of light and shadow, and the distant hum of life all contributed to an atmosphere that was both relaxing and charged with anticipation. It was in this calm tension that the story of Supreme McGriff would unfold, a narrative that weaves together ambition, strategy, danger, and the human complexities of those who walk the line between legend and reality. For those who listen closely, the whispers of the street speak not only of crime and power but of the subtle, almost imperceptible ways in which one man shaped the world around him, leaving an imprint that would linger long after the night had passed. In the stillness of Queens at night, it becomes possible to trace the early outlines of McGriff's journey, the first steps, the calculated risks, the quiet assertions of influence that, piece by piece, built an empire. It is here, in these shadows and soft murmurs of a borough that never truly sleeps, that the story begins, an exploration of power, human ambition, and the delicate balance between fear and respect. The streets themselves seem to guide the narrative, leading listeners into a world both distant and intimate, where every corner turned holds the possibility of revelation, every whispered name carries weight, and every shadow could conceal a lesson. As we begin this journey together, the calm night of Queens becomes a canvas upon which the life of the Emperor of Queens will be painted, stroke by careful stroke, inviting the audience to drift deeper into the story, both captivated and comforted by the gentle cadence of the narrative. Queens in the late 1960s and 1970s was a place of contrasts, a borough of layered identities, bustling streets, and hidden corners where ambition and survival intertwined. It was here, amid the crowded apartments, narrow streets, and neighborhoods echoing with laughter and the occasional shout, that Supreme McGriff began his life. The son of modest means, he grew up in a world where opportunities were scarce, yet the lessons of the streets were abundant. The rhythm of the borough, its constant motion, its chatter, its tension, formed the backdrop of his earliest memories, shaping his understanding of people, loyalty, and the fragile nature of respect. These streets were both a playground and a battleground, a place where young men learned quickly that every gesture, every word, and every glance carried weight. From a young age, McGriff was acutely aware of his environment. His family, though loving, faced economic hardships that were common in many Queens neighborhoods at the time. Parents worked tirelessly, often in multiple jobs, to make ends meet, while children like McGriff absorbed the realities around them, the scarcity of resources, the constant negotiation of space, and the ever-present need for caution. He witnessed neighbors struggling, friends drifting into petty crime, and the unspoken rules that govern survival in these streets. These early observations were formative, instilling in him a sharp awareness of human behavior, an ability to read people, and a sense of determination that would later define his rise in the criminal world. Despite these challenges, there were moments of innocence in McGriff's youth, quiet afternoons spent playing stickball in the streets, the smell of food drifting from local diners, the laughter of children echoing through the blocks. These moments contrasted sharply with the harsher lessons he was also absorbing. Queens offered a duality, on one hand, the familiarity of home, family, and community, on the other, a constant exposure to the undercurrents of crime, drugs, and opportunistic violence. For McGriff, navigating this duality became a skill. He learned when to blend in, when to observe, and when to assert himself, understanding that survival often required more than physical strength, it required foresight, patience, and subtlety. School, for many children in his neighborhood, was both a refuge and a challenge. McGriff experienced it as a place where authority was respected yet questioned, where lessons extended beyond the classroom into the interactions with peers and local figures of influence. While formal education offered limited pathways to advancement, the lessons learned outside the walls of school were far more immediate and consequential. Friendships were tested by circumstance, loyalty was measured in small but telling ways, and respect was earned through actions rather than words. McGriff absorbed these lessons with remarkable attentiveness, gradually honing a keen sense of strategy and situational awareness that would later underpin his empire-building instincts. By adolescence, the streets themselves became McGriff's informal classroom. He observed older boys and men navigating the delicate hierarchy of local crews, paying attention to the subtle interplay of trust, fear, and influence. The young McGriff recognized that power could be wielded quietly, without spectacle, and that reputation often preceded action. In the alleys and backrooms of Queens, he learned to negotiate, to anticipate moves before they were made, and to maintain a calm presence even when surrounded by chaos. These early lessons were foundational, teaching him the importance of patience, observation, and calculated risk, a mindset that would distinguish him from many of his peers. Family life, though marked by economic strain, provided a framework of values and expectations. McGriff witnessed firsthand the sacrifices of his parents, their determination to protect and guide him despite limited means. He also observed the vulnerabilities of those around him, friends who fell into trouble, neighbors ensnared by drugs or violence, and relatives struggling to stay afloat in a harsh environment. These observations instilled a nuanced understanding of the choices people make when survival is at stake, and a growing awareness that influence and control were often more potent than brute force alone. From an early age, he began to see the potential in carefully cultivated alliances, in strategic patience, and in knowing when to act and when to wait. The streets of Queens also taught lessons of consequence. Encounters with minor criminal activity, whether witnessed or participated in, highlighted the fine line between opportunity and danger. McGriff saw how small mistakes could escalate, how alliances could fracture, and how trust could be fragile. Each experience added to his understanding of the social and practical mechanics of power in his environment. He internalized these lessons with a quiet attentiveness, observing patterns, learning from both successes and failures, and gradually shaping a worldview that valued foresight, discretion, and calculated influence over impulsive action. In these formative years, McGriff's personality began to crystallize. He was attentive, perceptive, and patient, with an uncanny ability to read the intentions of those around him. His peers began to recognize his calm confidence and sharp intuition, traits that distinguished him from other adolescents navigating the same turbulent streets. He learned to command attention not through loud displays but through a steady presence, a reliability that inspired trust, and a subtle awareness of timing and opportunity. These qualities would later become hallmarks of his leadership style, allowing him to build influence and navigate the complexities of Queens' criminal underworld with precision. Queens itself, with its mixture of cultures, communities, and economic realities, provided a rich and often challenging backdrop for McGriff's early development. The streets, the local businesses, the schools, and the housing projects all contributed to a tapestry of experiences that taught him resilience, adaptability, and the importance of reputation. He learned to respect the unspoken rules of each neighborhood, to identify allies and potential threats, and to recognize the subtle ways in which power was distributed and exercised. This early immersion in the rhythms of Queens life laid the foundation for his later dominance, providing him with both the practical knowledge and the psychological insight needed to navigate a world where authority was earned as much through perception as through action. Even amid the pressures of adolescence and the temptations of the streets, there were moments of reflection and strategy. McGriff exhibited a rare capacity for forward thinking, imagining not just immediate gains but long-term outcomes. He began to envision a path that extended beyond petty crime, a trajectory that, while not fully realized in those early years, foreshadowed the empire he would eventually build. His awareness of both opportunity and risk deepened, as did his understanding of human nature, loyalty, and influence. These lessons, absorbed quietly yet deliberately, would form the blueprint for the choices and strategies that defined his rise in the criminal world. By the time he reached late adolescence, McGriff was already demonstrating the qualities that would later earn him the moniker Emperor of Queens. He was strategic, disciplined, and observant, with an ability to command respect and inspire loyalty without resorting to unnecessary aggression. The streets of Queens, with all their complexity and contradiction, had shaped him into a figure capable of navigating both the visible and hidden dynamics of his community. His early life was a delicate interplay of observation, experience, and instinct, a preparation for the empire that he would one day construct with both patience and precision. In this environment, McGriff's story began not with fame or infamy, but with quiet accumulation of knowledge, alliances, and understanding, a foundation that would support the extraordinary rise to come. As McGriff moved through the streets of Queens in his late teens, the lessons of his upbringing began to crystallize into a practical understanding of survival and influence. The environment he navigated was unforgiving, even small missteps could carry consequences far beyond their immediate appearance. The line between a simple mistake and a dangerous escalation was thin, and McGriff learned early that observation, patience, and strategy were as crucial as courage. These formative experiences marked the beginning of his direct engagement with the world of crime, though his approach was always measured, calculated, and deeply rooted in the keen awareness that every choice carried both opportunity and risk. His first encounters with criminal activity were often small in scale but significant in impact, a series of subtle tests that shaped his instincts and sharpened his understanding of human behavior. Petty thefts, minor hustles, and early attempts at influence allowed him to gauge the responses of others, to understand the unspoken social contracts that governed interactions on the street. McGriff quickly realized that brute force alone could not sustain respect or command loyalty. Influence had to be cultivated carefully, often through quiet acts of observation, negotiation, and occasional demonstrations of decisive action. These early ventures, while limited in scale, provided a laboratory for learning, a place where consequences were immediate and lessons were clear. One of the most striking aspects of McGriff's early involvement in crime was his ability to maintain a calm and unassuming demeanor, even in situations charged with tension. While many young men relied on bluster or intimidation to assert dominance, McGriff favored subtlety and foresight. He understood that the perception of control could be as powerful as control itself, that the silent awareness of those around him could amplify influence far more effectively than overt aggression. This quiet authority, combined with his emerging skill in reading people, made him both respected and cautiously observed by peers and potential rivals. Each interaction became a test of character, a measure of his ability to navigate complex social dynamics while advancing his position in the hierarchy of the street. The mentors and figures he encountered during these formative years played a critical role in shaping his approach. Older individuals involved in various criminal activities, from small-scale hustlers to seasoned street operatives, offered insights into both the mechanics and psychology of influence. McGriff absorbed these lessons with careful attention, recognizing patterns in behavior, understanding the subtleties of trust and betrayal, and learning to anticipate the moves of others before they were made. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he did not rush to action without consideration. Instead, he cultivated patience, assessing opportunities with a strategic lens, and acting only when the potential rewards justified the risk. Even as McGriff engaged in these early acts, he maintained an acute awareness of law enforcement and the consequences of exposure. The presence of police in Queens was a constant, their patrols, investigations, and occasional raids serving as a reminder that every decision carried risk. McGriff's approach to crime was therefore as much about discretion as it was about ambition. He learned to navigate the fine line between opportunity and danger, understanding that visibility could erode influence and compromise long-term objectives. This understanding became a foundational principle, guiding not only his early activities but also the development of the empire he would later construct. Alongside these practical lessons, McGriff's reputation began to take shape. Early successes, combined with his measured approach and calm confidence, began to attract attention from peers and potential allies. Those who recognized his intelligence and foresight saw value in aligning with him, while rivals began to gauge the threat he posed. His emerging reputation was not built on violence alone, though he was not averse to using force when necessary. Rather, it was rooted in the perception of competence, the ability to anticipate outcomes, and the subtle art of influence that allowed him to command respect without overt displays of power. This growing presence in the neighborhood laid the groundwork for the alliances and networks that would later become the backbone of his operations. The environment of Queens during this period provided both challenge and opportunity. The streets were filled with economic disparity, community resilience, and an undercurrent of tension that shaped daily life. McGriff learned to interpret this landscape, understanding not just the people he encountered but the structures and dynamics that influenced their decisions. He observed how local businesses, informal networks, and social hierarchies interacted with one another, and he began to identify niches where influence could be leveraged effectively. This observational skill, honed in adolescence, would later allow him to orchestrate operations with a level of precision that few could match, turning the chaos of the streets into a landscape he could navigate and, eventually, control. Alongside his practical and strategic growth, McGriff's personal charisma began to play a significant role. His calm confidence, combined with an intuitive understanding of social dynamics, drew people toward him. Friends and allies found themselves naturally aligned with his vision, while those who might oppose him hesitated, uncertain how to navigate his presence. Charisma, in McGriff's case, was not loud or flashy, it was quiet, understated, yet deeply effective. It allowed him to inspire loyalty, foster cooperation, and subtly manipulate outcomes without resorting to overt intimidation. In this way, his early criminal activities were as much about relationship building as they were about material gain, setting the stage for a network that extended far beyond immediate transactions. As McGriff's experience and reputation grew, so too did the complexity of the operations he became involved in. Early ventures into theft, hustling, and small-scale deals evolved into more coordinated efforts, involving multiple actors and requiring careful planning. He began to understand logistics, timing, and the importance of contingency planning, recognizing that even minor oversights could have cascading consequences. These early operations were laboratories for strategy, where mistakes could be instructive and successes reinforced patterns of disciplined action. Each engagement, each calculated risk, became part of a growing body of knowledge that would underpin the empire he would eventually lead. Perhaps most importantly, McGriff's early experiences taught him the delicate interplay of trust and betrayal. He witnessed firsthand how alliances could fracture under pressure, how misjudgments could erode respect, and how subtle gestures could signal loyalty or treachery. These lessons were absorbed quietly, forming an intuitive understanding of human nature that would guide him for years to come. He learned that influence was earned as much through consistency, reliability, and strategic generosity as it was through fear or aggression. By cultivating a balance between respect, subtle intimidation, and careful discretion, McGriff began to lay the psychological groundwork for the dominance that would later define his reign over Queen's underworld. By the close of his teenage years, McGriff had moved beyond mere participation in street-level crime. He was developing a mindset of leadership, strategy, and empire building. The early thefts, minor hustles, and tests of influence had provided more than material gain, they had been a training ground for foresight, decision-making, and human insight. His reputation, forged quietly through observation, subtle action, and consistent reliability, positioned him as someone others could follow or fear. In the microcosm of Queen's streets, the foundations of a future empire were quietly being laid, built on lessons learned in alleys, schoolyards, and backrooms, each step measured, deliberate, and strategic. These formative experiences, though seemingly small in scale, were essential in shaping McGriff's understanding of the world he would later dominate. They provided a foundation of strategic thinking, observational acuity, and social intelligence that would become hallmarks of his leadership style. As listeners drift into the cadence of the story, it becomes clear that his journey was not propelled by sudden luck or brute force alone, but by a deliberate, thoughtful accumulation of knowledge, alliances, and influence. The quiet streets of Queens, the early challenges of adolescence, and the subtle tests of loyalty and skill all combined to forge the mind of a man who would one day be called the Emperor of Queens. As McGriff moved further into the rhythms of Queen's streets, he began to understand that survival alone was not enough to command respect. Influence and reputation were the currencies that truly mattered, and to acquire them, he needed alliances, mentors, and an awareness of potential rivals. These early social dynamics were subtle yet consequential, forming the foundation for the network he would later rely on to consolidate power. He observed how other figures in the neighborhood navigated these relationships, noticing the delicate balance between friendship and manipulation, loyalty and opportunism, trust and suspicion. It was a world where a single word, a brief gesture, or a momentary lapse in judgment could have ramifications far beyond the immediate context. In this environment, McGriff's calm intelligence and strategic mindset allowed him to cultivate relationships deliberately, ensuring that every connection strengthened his influence rather than exposed him to vulnerability. The alliances he formed in these years were not random, they were carefully considered, based on a mix of trust, respect, and shared objectives. McGriff recognized early that he could not rise alone, and that even the most capable individuals benefited from allies who could provide complementary skills, protection, or access to resources. He began to identify potential partners who demonstrated reliability, courage, and an understanding of the unspoken rules of the streets. At the same time, he learned to gauge the intentions of those around him, recognizing signs of ambition, envy, or disloyalty that could threaten his carefully constructed network. Each relationship was both an opportunity and a test, offering potential gains while requiring constant vigilance. The formation of his early crew marked a turning point in McGriff's trajectory. These individuals were more than accomplices, they were extensions of his vision, capable of executing his plans with precision and discretion. Together, they navigated the complex landscape of Queens neighborhoods, balancing the demands of competition, survival, and loyalty. McGriff's leadership style was subtle yet effective, relying not on overt displays of force but on a quiet authority that inspired trust and obedience. He understood that true influence came from the perception of competence, the consistent exercise of judgment, and the ability to anticipate outcomes before others could. This approach allowed him to maintain cohesion within his group, even as external pressures and rivalries threatened to destabilize their operations. Rivalries, in particular, shaped much of McGriff's early strategic thinking. Queens, like many urban areas, was a patchwork of competing factions, each seeking control over territory, resources, or reputation. Encounters with these rival groups were instructive, offering lessons in negotiation, deterrence, and the subtle application of power. McGriff learned to gauge when confrontation was necessary, when diplomacy could achieve the same objectives, and when patience could outlast impulsive aggression. These experiences taught him that dominance was not merely about winning battles, but about projecting a presence that commanded respect even in the absence of direct action. By the time he was fully embedded in his early networks, he had developed a sophisticated understanding of both the psychology and logistics of influence. Within his own crew, McGriff cultivated loyalty with care, understanding that the strength of an organization depended on the reliability and motivation of its members. He paid attention to the smallest details, how individuals responded to challenges, how they communicated with one another, and how they managed risk. By fostering an environment in which competence was recognized and rewarded, and missteps were addressed with discretion, he created a sense of mutual dependence that bound his associates to him both practically and psychologically. This subtle form of leadership, quiet yet firm, strategic yet attentive, became a hallmark of his approach and would distinguish him from others who relied solely on fear or coercion to maintain control. As McGriff's influence grew, the lines between friend and rival became increasingly significant. He learned to navigate a social ecosystem in which alliances could shift quickly, and in which misjudging a single relationship could have cascading consequences. Observing the behavior of others, anticipating potential betrayals, and maintaining the perception of reliability became constant exercises. Yet he also understood that alliances could be leveraged to expand power beyond immediate circles. By carefully cultivating relationships with key figures, whether for protection, information, or operational advantage, he began to extend his influence across neighborhoods, gradually establishing a network that was as strategic as it was resilient. This network became the foundation upon which his future empire would be built. The streets themselves played a role in shaping McGriff's understanding of human behavior and social dynamics. Corner stores, basketball courts, playgrounds, and apartment stairwells all became sites of observation, where he could study interactions, measure reputations, and identify patterns in the behavior of allies and adversaries alike. In these ordinary spaces, he honed a subtle form of intelligence gathering, noting who commanded respect, who faltered under pressure, and who could be relied upon in moments of crisis. These insights, accumulated over years of careful observation, allowed him to make strategic decisions that were both calculated and adaptive. His growing reputation was rooted not only in action but in an almost intuitive grasp of human nature, a talent that allowed him to anticipate moves, shape outcomes, and maintain cohesion within his circle. Even as he cultivated alliances and navigated rivalries, McGriff remained acutely aware of the broader risks inherent in his environment. The presence of law enforcement, rival factions, and opportunistic individuals meant that every engagement carried the potential for escalation. He learned to balance ambition with discretion, acting decisively when necessary but avoiding exposure that could jeopardize his plans. This strategic patience, combined with his ability to read social cues and interpret subtle signals, allowed him to operate with a level of effectiveness that few could match. His early experiences demonstrated that influence was a careful blend of perception, action, and timing, a lesson that would serve as a guiding principle throughout his rise to power. The reputation McGriff cultivated during this period extended beyond his immediate circle. Peers, rivals, and neighbors alike began to recognize a subtle but undeniable authority in his presence. He was not the loudest or most aggressive figure in the streets, yet his actions carried weight, and his judgments were respected. The perception of competence, combined with his strategic foresight, allowed him to project power without unnecessary exposure, creating an aura that both inspired loyalty and instilled caution. This growing influence attracted attention from other ambitious figures in Queens, opening doors to larger opportunities while simultaneously increasing the stakes of his actions. Each alliance, each negotiation, and each calculated risk became part of a larger tapestry of strategy, weaving together the relationships and networks that would define his early career. By the time he had fully established these early networks, McGriff had developed not only practical skills but also a deep understanding of the psychological components of influence. He recognized that loyalty was earned as much through consistency and reliability as through displays of force, that fear could complement respect but could not replace it, and that careful observation could reveal far more than impulsive action. These insights became the pillars upon which he would build his operations, allowing him to extend his reach and consolidate power without attracting unnecessary attention. His early ability to form alliances, navigate rivalries, and maintain a reputation for competence marked a crucial stage in his development, setting the stage for the broader empire that would follow. Ultimately, this period in McGriff's life demonstrated the power of deliberate strategy, quiet observation, and careful cultivation of relationships. By building a network of allies and managing the tensions of rivalries, he established both influence and credibility within Queen Streets. Each decision, each interaction, and each calculated risk contributed to a foundation that would support his future ascent. The lessons learned here, the importance of loyalty, perception, and strategic patience, would become guiding principles, shaping not only his actions but the very structure of the empire he was destined to lead. In the quiet, shadowed streets of Queens, the early threads of McGriff's story were being woven, subtle yet strong, a tapestry of strategy, insight, and human understanding that would define his rise and command attention for years to come. As the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, Queens was transforming under the weight of economic shifts, cultural changes, and the stark realities of the drug trade. For Supreme McGriff, these changes were not merely background noise, they were opportunities waiting to be seized, landscapes where ambition could take root and flourish. The crack cocaine epidemic was reshaping neighborhoods, creating both wealth and peril, and McGriff, with his keen understanding of human behavior and strategic insight, recognized the potential for influence and power embedded within these streets. Unlike many who rushed recklessly into the trade, he approached it with the same calm, calculated assessment that had guided his earlier alliances and interactions, carefully weighing risk, reward, and long-term sustainability. His entry into the drug trade was deliberate, measured, and informed by observation. McGriff had witnessed the impact of drugs on his community, the addiction, the violence, and the rapid rise and fall of those who sought quick wealth without strategy. He saw both the opportunities for profit and the dangers of exposure, and he approached this world with a mindset that blended caution with ambition. Early operations were modest, designed to test the waters and gauge the reactions of both the street and law enforcement. Yet even in these initial ventures, his presence was marked by strategic foresight, subtle influence, and the ability to coordinate individuals and resources in a manner that many of his peers could not replicate. McGriff's early dealings in the drug trade were characterized by a quiet efficiency that belied the magnitude of the operations he would eventually oversee. He understood that logistics, timing, and control over supply lines were just as crucial as personal relationships and reputation. Distribution networks required careful management, knowing which corners to prioritize, which associates could be trusted with responsibility, and how to maintain discretion in an environment under constant scrutiny. These operational challenges became a laboratory for his developing skills in leadership, strategy, and human management, allowing him to refine methods that would later scale into a more extensive empire. Even as he managed these practical aspects, McGriff remained acutely aware of the moral and social dimensions of his actions. The drug trade was not a sterile business, it impacted real people, communities, and lives in ways that extended beyond mere transactions. He observed the consequences of addiction, the strain on families, and the subtle shifts in neighborhood dynamics caused by the influx of wealth and violence. While his primary aim was to build influence and ensure the survival of his operations, McGriff's awareness of these broader effects informed his decisions, instilling a nuanced understanding of cause, consequence, and perception. This consciousness of context would become a hallmark of his leadership style, allowing him to navigate both the operational and human elements of power with a rare sophistication. The expansion of McGriff's operations required not only strategic planning but also an understanding of the networks of trust that governed the streets. He cultivated relationships with suppliers, distributors, and allies who understood the stakes and could operate discreetly. At the same time, he remained vigilant regarding potential rivals, recognizing that threats could emerge from unexpected quarters. Each new partnership was approached with caution, tested subtly, and monitored continuously to ensure loyalty and competence. This methodical approach allowed him to scale operations without exposing himself or his associates to unnecessary risk, creating a foundation for sustainable influence that many of his contemporaries could not match. The physical environment of Queens played a significant role in these operations. Street corners, apartment complexes, and local hangouts became nodes in a network carefully managed by McGriff and his associates. Each location was evaluated for accessibility, visibility, and strategic advantage, and each member of his crew understood their role within this system. He integrated observation and intuition, using knowledge gained from years on the streets to anticipate challenges, mitigate risks, and respond to shifts in the neighborhood's social and economic landscape. In this way, the borough itself became a canvas for his enterprise, a space in which his foresight and planning could manifest tangible influence and control. Financial acumen also became increasingly important as operations expanded. McGriff understood that profitability was not solely derived from volume, it required careful management of resources, allocation of risk, and reinvestment in the structures that sustained the enterprise. Cash flow, storage, and discrete movement of funds all demanded attention, and McGriff approached these challenges with the same strategic mindset that had guided his earlier social maneuverings. By ensuring operational efficiency, he minimized exposure and maximized influence, demonstrating that empire building in the streets required both tactical and administrative skill. This dual approach, balancing human, logistical, and financial considerations, set him apart from others who relied on force or intimidation alone. As the network grew, McGriff's reputation evolved in parallel. He was recognized not merely for involvement in the trade but for the precision, discretion, and authority with which he conducted himself. Allies and rivals alike began to understand that McGriff's operations were structured, resilient, and intelligent. He had cultivated an aura of competence that extended beyond individual acts, creating a perception that his influence was both inevitable and inescapable. This reputation, carefully nurtured over time, allowed him to operate with a degree of freedom and respect that reinforced the stability of his empire, while also providing a psychological advantage over those who might challenge him. Despite the calm and calculated nature of his approach, the dangers of the drug trade were ever present. Rival factions, law enforcement, and the unpredictability of human behavior created a landscape of constant vigilance. McGriff understood that even minor missteps could escalate into significant threats, and he emphasized the importance of discipline, loyalty, and observation within his organization. Each associate was carefully evaluated, each move strategically considered, and each interaction treated as an opportunity to strengthen control while minimizing risk. This careful orchestration was as much about sustaining influence as it was about building wealth, and it reflected a sophisticated understanding of the interplay between power, perception, and action. McGriff's approach to expansion also reflected his awareness of timing and opportunity. He recognized that entering new areas or increasing operations required not only resources but also social intelligence, the ability to read rival factions, assess potential risks, and anticipate the reactions of both allies and adversaries. This patience, combined with his understanding of human dynamics, allowed him to extend influence without overextending, building a stable foundation for growth even in a volatile and high-risk environment. Each step forward was calculated, deliberate, and informed by both observation and experience, demonstrating a level of strategic foresight rare among contemporaries in the same scene. The early 1990s thus became a period of consolidation, experimentation, and quiet ascendancy for McGriff. His initial steps into the crack cocaine trade were not merely transactions, they were opportunities to test strategy, refine leadership, and build networks of trust and influence. He moved with a calm confidence, navigating complex social, logistical, and financial challenges, and in doing so, laid the groundwork for the empire that would eventually dominate Queens. These years were marked by subtlety, patience, and the steady accumulation of both resources and reputation, a combination that would ultimately distinguish McGriff from others in the neighborhood and set the stage for his emergence as the Emperor of Queens. Even as he expanded his operations, McGriff never lost sight of the broader picture. He understood that the empire he was constructing required balance, the integration of logistics, human relationships, and perception, the careful negotiation of alliances, and the constant awareness of risk. By approaching the drug trade with a mix of pragmatism, intelligence, and strategic foresight, he transformed an environment defined by chaos into one in which he could exert influence and control. The streets of Queens, alive with movement, opportunity, and danger, became both a proving ground and a stage, where his vision, discipline, and understanding of human behavior converged to create a foundation for power that would endure for years to come. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Queens had transformed into a borough teeming with opportunity and danger alike. The crack epidemic had reshaped neighborhoods, filling streets with both wealth and tension, and Supreme McGriff, with his keen intellect and quiet observation, recognized that this turbulent environment was a landscape ripe for strategic influence. Unlike many of his peers, who were drawn into the trade recklessly, McGriff approached this world with a careful eye, analyzing patterns, assessing risks, and anticipating both challenges and opportunities before stepping forward. For him, entering the drug trade was not an impulsive act of rebellion but a calculated step toward building an empire that was as much psychological as it was financial. His initial steps into the crack cocaine trade were deliberate, measured, and designed to test both the market and the people who operated within it. Early ventures were small in scale, allowing him to gauge the dynamics of supply, demand, and competition. He observed how distribution networks functioned, noting the importance of discretion, timing, and loyalty. Even minor mistakes in these early operations could have cascading consequences, and McGriff understood that success required precision, strategy, and the ability to manage both resources and people. Each transaction, each decision, became an exercise in control, observation, and strategic thinking, a microcosm of the larger empire he envisioned. At the heart of McGriff's approach was a deep understanding of human behavior. He recognized that the drug trade was not simply about moving product but about managing relationships, perceptions, and influence. He cultivated loyalty among his associates, ensuring that those who worked with him understood both their responsibilities and the consequences of failure. He observed potential rivals carefully, assessing their ambitions, tendencies, and vulnerabilities, and used this insight to make preemptive decisions that would protect his operations. This psychological acuity became one of his greatest strengths, allowing him to navigate a dangerous and ever-changing environment with a level of control that many others lacked. McGriff's early operations were also defined by a disciplined focus on logistics. Distribution required careful planning, knowing which neighborhoods were profitable, which routes minimized exposure, and which associates could be trusted to manage specific corners or deliveries. He approached these challenges with the same meticulous attention to detail that had guided his earlier social maneuvers, understanding that operational efficiency and discretion were critical for long-term success. Cash flow had to be managed, supply lines secured, and contingencies anticipated. By mastering these practical elements, he created a foundation for influence that extended beyond immediate transactions, allowing him to expand without drawing unnecessary attention from law enforcement or rival factions. While the financial and operational aspects of the drug trade were important, McGriff also understood its social and psychological dimensions. The influx of wealth and power into Queens had ripple effects, neighborhoods changed, loyalties shifted, and communities responded to new hierarchies. McGriff navigated this terrain carefully, aware of how perception could enhance or undermine authority. He cultivated an image of competence, reliability, and quiet dominance, ensuring that his presence was felt even when he was not directly involved in a given operation. This ability to project influence through reputation was as crucial as the management of product or cash, reinforcing his emerging status as a strategic thinker and a figure of authority within the borough. Trust was the linchpin of his early expansion. McGriff understood that a network could only thrive if its members were reliable, disciplined, and motivated by a combination of respect and shared interest. He tested alliances subtly, observing how individuals reacted under pressure, how they managed responsibility, and whether they could operate without constant supervision. These evaluations were not merely transactional, they were a study in character, an ongoing assessment of human behavior that would allow him to anticipate problems and reinforce loyalty. The careful cultivation of trust created a resilient foundation for growth, ensuring that even as operations expanded, the core of his network remained cohesive and dependable. At the same time, McGriff remained acutely aware of the ever-present dangers. Rival factions, law enforcement scrutiny, and the unpredictability of human nature meant that every decision carried weight. He approached these risks with calm calculation, emphasizing discipline, observation, and preemptive strategy. Unlike those who relied solely on fear or aggression, McGriff balanced subtle intimidation with earned respect, ensuring that his authority was both acknowledged and sustainable. This careful orchestration of influence and control allowed him to operate effectively, building power and wealth while minimizing exposure to threats that could destabilize his growing network. As his operations matured, McGriff demonstrated an ability to scale his activities strategically. He identified opportunities for expansion, calculated the necessary resources, and assessed both allies and potential threats in each new area. Timing was crucial. Moving too quickly could attract law enforcement attention or provoke rival retaliation, while hesitation could allow competitors to seize territory. By pacing his growth carefully, he extended influence steadily, consolidating control while maintaining operational stability. His foresight allowed him to anticipate conflicts before they erupted, negotiate alliances where needed, and cultivate an aura of inevitability that reinforced his standing in Queens' underworld. Financial strategy also became increasingly important during this period. McGriff understood that raw profits were only valuable if they were managed effectively. He monitored cash flow, secured resources, and reinvested in ways that reinforced the structure of his operations. This administrative discipline complemented his tactical skills, allowing him to create an enterprise that was sustainable, adaptable, and resistant to disruption. By integrating human management, logistics, and financial oversight, he constructed a framework for power that transcended the limitations of street-level operations, positioning himself as a figure capable of strategic thinking on a larger scale. Even as he expanded his influence, McGriff remained mindful of the social impact of his actions. He observed the communities around him, the families, neighbors, and friends affected by the trade, and incorporated an understanding of these dynamics into his approach. While his ultimate goals were rooted in control and profit, he recognized that perception mattered, and that maintaining influence required a careful balance of respect, discretion, and strategic generosity. This awareness of the broader social landscape added a layer of sophistication to his operations, differentiating him from others who acted purely on impulse or ambition. By the early 1990s, McGriff had transformed his initial steps in the drug trade into a structured, influential network. He had built a reputation not only for operational efficiency but for strategic foresight, psychological acuity, and disciplined management. Allies were drawn to his competence, rivals were cautious in their approach, and law enforcement scrutiny, though present, was mitigated by his careful attention to discretion. His early ventures were no longer isolated acts of opportunism, they were the foundation of an emerging empire, a network of influence and control that extended across neighborhoods, built on trust, strategy, and the quiet exercise of authority. This period also marked the beginning of McGriff's recognition beyond his immediate circle. Peers, community members, and even rival operators began to understand that he was more than just another figure in the streets, he was a strategist, a leader, and an emerging authority. His calm confidence, combined with a methodical approach to risk and reward, created a sense of inevitability around his influence. The early successes in the crack cocaine trade were therefore not just financial victories, they were demonstrations of skill, judgment, and the disciplined application of power. In these quiet but consequential victories, the blueprint for McGriff's empire began to emerge, signaling the start of a reign that would earn him the title Emperor of Queens. By the early 1990s, Supreme McGriff's presence in Queens had begun to extend far beyond the small circles of friends and early associates. The empire he was quietly assembling was no longer defined solely by street-level transactions or opportunistic alliances, it was a network of influence, respect, and strategic control that touched multiple neighborhoods. The borough itself became a stage for his expanding operations, each corner, each apartment complex, and each familiar streetlight serving as part of a carefully observed system. McGriff's rise was neither flashy nor overtly violent, at least in the early stages, it was the subtle assertion of authority, the quiet shaping of perception, and the meticulous orchestration of logistics that earned him a growing reputation as a figure not to be underestimated. His dominance was rooted in a combination of human intelligence, operational precision, and an understanding of social dynamics that few could match. McGriff recognized that true power in Queens was as much about perception as it was about actual control. Respect and fear were both currencies, but the most enduring authority was that which commanded attention without unnecessary display. He cultivated an aura of calm confidence, a presence that suggested both competence and inevitability. Those who crossed paths with him, whether allies, rivals, or casual observers, could sense a subtle command in his demeanor, an unspoken understanding that he was a man whose influence extended further than most could anticipate. The networks McGriff had built were intricate, composed of carefully chosen individuals who shared his vision, reliability, and understanding of the unspoken rules of the streets. Each member of his operation had a defined role, whether in distribution, surveillance, financial management, or negotiation. McGriff's leadership style was precise and measured, he rarely relied on force to assert authority, instead emphasizing consistency, discretion, and strategic foresight. He had learned that loyalty was most effectively maintained through respect and trust, not fear alone. Those who worked with him understood that competence was valued and that missteps carried consequences, but they also experienced the quiet steadiness of a leader who valued foresight over impulsiveness. As his operations expanded, the contrast between McGriff's calm strategic approach and the chaotic violence often associated with street empires became apparent. While many contemporaries relied on aggressive displays of power to assert dominance, McGriff moved with a careful balance of patience and precision. He understood the importance of timing, knowing when to act directly, when to delegate, and when to wait for the right moment. This measured approach allowed him to consolidate influence without drawing unnecessary attention from rivals or law enforcement, and it contributed to a reputation of inevitability, an aura that made opposition seem not only risky but often futile. The social dimension of McGriff's rise was equally significant. He understood that influence was reinforced by perception, that neighborhoods responded to reputation as much as to actual control. By maintaining a combination of visibility and discretion, he cultivated respect and caution in equal measure. His presence could be felt without overt action, whispered conversations on stoops, cautious glances in the corner store, the subtle acknowledgement of authority in everyday interactions. Through these quiet cues, McGriff extended his reach far beyond the immediate confines of his operations, shaping the environment in ways that reinforced both his personal authority and the stability of his emerging empire. Conflict and competition were inevitable, and McGriff's rise was punctuated by encounters with rival factions and ambitious individuals seeking to carve out their own influence. Each confrontation, however subtle or overt, provided an opportunity to demonstrate strategic acumen. He learned when to negotiate, when to assert authority quietly, and when decisive action was required. These interactions were never impulsive, they were calculated, based on careful observation and an understanding of both human psychology and logistical realities. Through these measured responses, he reinforced his reputation while minimizing unnecessary risk, further consolidating his power in the borough. At the operational level, McGriff's empire required sophisticated coordination. Distribution networks were not merely transactional, they were dynamic systems that demanded oversight, communication, and adaptation. He ensured that each component functioned smoothly, from the individuals handling product movement to those managing finances and logistics. Contingencies were planned, risks evaluated, and outcomes anticipated. This level of organization, combined with his strategic use of alliances and perception management, allowed McGriff to extend influence across Queens in a manner that was both resilient and flexible. It was a form of empire building that emphasized structure and foresight, contrasting with the chaos that characterized many other street-level operations. The psychological component of his leadership cannot be overstated. McGriff had a deep understanding of human behavior, loyalty, and influence. He recognized that people were motivated by a mixture of respect, fear, opportunity, and ambition. By calibrating his interactions carefully, showing discretion, rewarding competence, and demonstrating decisiveness, he fostered loyalty while deterring betrayal. This balance allowed him to maintain cohesion within his networks, even as they expanded and faced external pressures. Associates came to trust not only his judgment but also the stability and reliability of his operations, creating a feedback loop that strengthened both his influence and the operational integrity of his empire. Financial control was a parallel pillar of his ascendancy. McGriff understood that influence in the streets required not only human and logistical management but also careful oversight of resources. Cash flow, reinvestment, and risk mitigation were as critical as the daily operations of distribution and enforcement. By maintaining rigorous oversight and strategic allocation of funds, he ensured the sustainability of his operations while minimizing vulnerabilities that could be exploited by rivals or law enforcement. This combination of operational efficiency, financial acumen, and psychological insight distinguished McGriff from contemporaries, positioning him as a figure whose authority was both tangible and enduring. The apex of McGriff's early rise was not defined by violence alone but by the subtle and deliberate consolidation of influence across neighborhoods, networks, and social structures. He had created an ecosystem in which authority was acknowledged, loyalty was cultivated, and operations functioned with precision. The borough itself became a reflection of his strategic mind, each street, block, and intersection part of a carefully observed landscape where perception, influence, and control intertwined. This rise, quiet but undeniable, earned him recognition not just among peers but within the broader social fabric of Queens, where whispered acknowledgement of his authority spoke volumes. Even as McGriff's influence expanded, he remained aware of the delicate balance that sustained his power. The interplay between fear and respect, visibility and discretion, ambition and loyalty was continuous. He knew that dominance was never static, that each day brought new challenges and potential disruptions. Yet his calm, methodical approach allowed him to adapt, anticipate threats, and reinforce authority without unnecessary exposure. In this way, his rise was both steady and resilient, a testament to strategic patience, operational intelligence, and the subtle exercise of influence in a world where perception was as important as action. By the early 1990s, McGriff's presence in Queens had reached a level of influence that few could rival. His empire, built through careful observation, strategic alliances, operational efficiency, and psychological insight, was now firmly established. The contrast between his calm authority and the often chaotic environment around him highlighted the uniqueness of his approach. Through patience, foresight, and calculated action, McGriff had transformed the borough into both a proving ground and a stage for his emerging power, quietly solidifying his reputation as the Emperor of Queens long before the moniker became widely recognized. As Supreme McGriff's influence grew across Queens, it became increasingly clear that power was as much a matter of perception as it was of control. The streets themselves had become a theater in which authority could be projected, subtlety could wield influence, and fear could serve as a silent currency. McGriff understood this dynamic better than most, and he honed the art of intimidation not through reckless displays of force but through calculated presence, quiet gestures, and an aura of inevitability. His ability to command respect without overt aggression became one of his defining traits, a psychological skill that allowed him to maintain cohesion within his networks while projecting influence far beyond his immediate circle. This form of intimidation was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet deeply effective. McGriff's calm demeanor, his measured movements, and his quiet confidence conveyed authority in ways that could unsettle rivals and inspire loyalty simultaneously. He understood that power did not always need to be demonstrated through violence. Often, the mere suggestion of capability was enough to shape behavior and outcomes. A glance, a strategic remark, or even a well-timed silence could communicate volumes. Through these methods, he cultivated an environment in which respect and caution were instinctual, and opposition became a calculated risk rather than an impulsive choice. Within his own crew, this aura of quiet authority reinforced cohesion. Associates were aware that McGriff's expectations were precise, that competence was recognized and rewarded, and that mistakes carried consequences, though they were often administered with subtlety rather than spectacle. Loyalty, in this context, was both practical and psychological. People aligned with him not only because they benefited materially but because they respected his intelligence, judgment, and presence. This interplay between respect and strategic intimidation allowed McGriff to maintain control over an expanding network without constant displays of violence, setting the stage for the larger empire he was quietly assembling. Rival factions and ambitious competitors soon learned the impact of McGriff's approach. Unlike many figures in the streets who relied on brash displays of aggression, McGriff's reputation alone could influence behavior. Competitors hesitated, assessed risk, and reconsidered potential moves simply because of the perception of his strategic awareness and reach. This psychological advantage amplified his operational effectiveness, allowing him to maintain dominance while conserving resources and minimizing unnecessary confrontations. Every interaction became an opportunity to assert influence subtly, reinforcing his position without overt conflict. The art of intimidation extended beyond personal presence to strategic manipulation of information and perception. McGriff understood that rumors, whispers, and selective disclosure could shape the environment just as effectively as direct action. He managed both his own image and the perceptions of others with care, creating an ecosystem in which allies, rivals, and observers alike understood his authority and capabilities without needing to witness them firsthand. This mastery of perception allowed him to extend his influence across neighborhoods, cultivating an aura of control that permeated the social fabric of Queens. Even as McGriff exercised this quiet power, he remained acutely aware of the fragile balance between influence and overreach. Excessive aggression or visible dominance could provoke challenges or attract unwanted attention from law enforcement. Conversely, hesitancy or inconsistency could erode authority and encourage disloyalty. McGriff navigated this tension with precision, calibrating each interaction to maintain credibility, demonstrate capability, and reinforce loyalty. In doing so, he created a dynamic in which respect was earned, fear was managed, and influence extended organically through the perception of competence and inevitability. The psychological dimension of his leadership extended to the handling of internal conflicts. Disputes within his crew or network were approached with careful consideration. McGriff understood that mishandling such situations could destabilize operations, weaken loyalty, or create opportunities for rivals. By exercising patience, observing behavior, and applying influence subtly, he could manage tensions before they escalated. His approach emphasized consistency, strategic discipline, and a careful balancing of authority and persuasion. These skills allowed him to maintain cohesion while simultaneously projecting strength and control beyond the immediate circle of associates. In his interactions with rivals, McGriff demonstrated an acute understanding of the psychology of intimidation. He knew that human behavior often responded more predictably to suggestion, reputation, and perception than to overt confrontation. By cultivating an image of strategic awareness, preparedness, and resilience, he could influence rivals' decisions, shape territorial negotiations, and preempt conflicts before they escalated. This subtle manipulation of perception reinforced his authority across Queens, establishing boundaries of influence that were respected and rarely challenged. The psychological impact of his presence became as significant as the operational or financial power he wielded. McGriff also understood the importance of timing in the exercise of influence. Strategic interventions, selective displays of decisiveness, and the careful orchestration of his visibility allowed him to shape outcomes without unnecessary exposure. He recognized that influence was most effective when it appeared natural and inevitable rather than forced or manufactured. By managing timing, perception, and the interactions of his network, he could reinforce authority continuously, creating an environment in which his decisions were accepted with minimal resistance and where his presence alone shaped behavior across multiple spheres of influence. The combination of psychological acuity, operational intelligence, and strategic presence created a form of power that was resilient and adaptive. McGriff's influence extended beyond immediate transactions, affecting decisions, alliances, and rivalries across the borough. His associates understood the subtle signals of expectation and consequence, while competitors and observers were attuned to the quiet authority he projected. This form of control, rooted in the careful calibration of intimidation, respect, and perception, allowed him to extend dominance without exposing himself to unnecessary risk. It was a sophisticated balance of human understanding and operational skill, reflecting a level of strategic mastery rare among his contemporaries. At the community level, McGriff's presence was also acknowledged indirectly. Residents, store owners, and casual observers sensed the order and structure he imposed on the neighborhood, even if they were not directly involved in his operations. The subtle management of territory, the quiet negotiation of influence, and the strategic exercise of authority all contributed to a perception that his reach extended beyond immediate associates. This indirect control reinforced his reputation, cultivated respect, and served as a silent warning to those who might consider challenging him. Even in absence, his influence remained palpable. The long-term impact of McGriff's mastery of intimidation was evident in the stability of his early operations. By combining subtle psychological influence with disciplined operational management, he could maintain control over expanding networks without relying on constant enforcement or overt displays of power. Associates were motivated by loyalty and respect, rivals were deterred by perception and caution, and the broader community understood the contours of his influence. This equilibrium of psychological and operational authority allowed him to consolidate power steadily, laying the groundwork for his eventual emergence as a dominant figure in Queens' underworld. Through these methods, McGriff transformed what might have been a volatile and chaotic street presence into a disciplined, strategic system of influence. His understanding of human psychology, combined with his operational skill and awareness of perception, enabled him to project authority effectively, manage risk, and extend influence across a complex urban landscape. Each interaction, each subtle gesture, and each calculated decision reinforced his reputation, cultivated loyalty, and deterred opposition. In this way, the art of intimidation became not a matter of brute force, but a sophisticated exercise in perception, strategy, and the quiet orchestration of power. By the early 1990s, Supreme McGriff's mastery of subtle intimidation had solidified his standing as a leader, a strategist, and a figure whose authority extended across Queens. The combination of calm presence, strategic foresight, and psychological insight allowed him to maintain cohesion within his networks, influence rivals, and project power across neighborhoods. It was an approach that blended human understanding with operational efficiency, perception with action, and patience with decisiveness. In the quiet streets, in whispered acknowledgments, and in the careful movements of his associates, McGriff's authority was unmistakable, a testament to the sophistication of his rise and the deliberate cultivation of an aura that would become central to his identity as the Emperor of Queens. By the early 1990s, Supreme McGriff's empire in Queens had grown to a point where influence, power, and wealth were intertwined in a delicate balance. The streets that once served merely as his training ground had become arteries of a complex system of operations, each corner, storefront, and apartment block contributing to a network that extended far beyond immediate neighborhoods. McGriff understood that money was more than a symbol of success, it was a tool of influence, a mechanism to secure loyalty, expand operations, and consolidate authority. Cash alone was not enough, how it was moved, managed, and leveraged determined the stability and reach of his empire. Financial acumen became a cornerstone of McGriff's rise. The drug trade, while lucrative, was fraught with risk, and mismanagement of resources could undermine even the most disciplined operation. He applied meticulous attention to the flow of money, ensuring that profits were allocated strategically, some for immediate operational needs, some reinvested to expand territory, and some carefully hidden or laundered to protect against scrutiny. This approach allowed him to maintain a balance between operational efficiency and long-term sustainability. The discipline with which he managed resources reflected not only intelligence but also foresight, anticipating challenges before they emerged and securing the means to navigate them effectively. As the scale of operations expanded, McGriff's understanding of human networks became increasingly vital. He recognized that money alone could not sustain influence, it required reliable associates, trustworthy allies, and a keen sense of loyalty. He cultivated relationships carefully, observing the behaviors, tendencies, and ambitions of those around him. Trust was measured in action rather than words, and he continuously evaluated the reliability of his crew. Each person within the network had a role, whether in distribution, logistics, enforcement, or intelligence gathering, and McGriff's ability to coordinate these roles with precision ensured that the entire system functioned seamlessly. In this way, the financial and social components of his empire were inseparable, each reinforcing the other. McGriff's operational reach extended beyond the immediate neighborhoods of Queens. By leveraging his growing reputation, he was able to negotiate alliances, mediate conflicts, and subtly influence the actions of competitors. The strategic use of wealth played a key role in this process. Payments, incentives, and timely support were used not merely to reward loyalty but to solidify networks, mitigate threats, and reinforce his position as a figure whose authority was both respected and feared. The careful orchestration of resources allowed him to exert influence across a broader territory without attracting unnecessary attention, maintaining a balance between visibility and discretion. The management of money and resources also intersected with legal and logistical considerations. McGriff was acutely aware of the presence of law enforcement and the potential for exposure. As operations expanded, so did the need for secure handling of cash, product, and communications. By implementing systems of oversight, redundancy, and discretion, he minimized vulnerabilities while maintaining operational efficiency. These practices were not merely defensive, they were proactive measures that allowed him to operate with confidence, extend influence, and ensure that his network remained resilient in the face of both external and internal pressures. Financial influence was reinforced through psychological and social mechanisms. McGriff understood that wealth projected power, stability, and credibility, and he used it strategically to maintain loyalty, command respect, and shape perception. Support, gifts, and resources were provided to allies, creating interdependence and reinforcing bonds of loyalty. Conversely, the careful withholding of resources or the strategic demonstration of financial capacity could signal authority and deter challenges. Through this integration of money, psychology, and influence, McGriff cultivated an ecosystem in which authority was acknowledged, networks were disciplined, and power extended organically through both tangible and intangible channels. The expansion of financial operations also required meticulous attention to risk management. McGriff understood that large sums of money, complex distribution systems, and expanding networks created opportunities for both operational errors and external threats. He implemented checks and oversight mechanisms to monitor transactions, evaluate performance, and anticipate potential breaches. By maintaining this vigilance, he ensured that his empire was resilient, adaptive, and capable of sustaining growth despite the inherent volatility of the streets. Risk, in McGriff's hands, was not merely a hazard, it was a factor to be anticipated, measured, and strategically managed. Alongside the operational and financial strategies, McGriff's reputation as a disciplined and intelligent leader continued to grow. Wealth alone did not define him, it was the manner in which he managed it, coordinated resources, and projected influence that reinforced his standing. Allies, rivals, and the broader community recognized his strategic acumen, understanding that his success was rooted not in chance but in deliberate planning, disciplined execution, and psychological insight. This perception amplified his influence, creating an aura that extended beyond material wealth into the social and operational fabric of Queens. Even as McGriff consolidated his financial power, he remained acutely aware of the balance required to maintain stability. Excessive accumulation, visible opulence, or reckless investment could provoke both competitors and law enforcement. Conversely, underutilization of resources could weaken influence and erode loyalty. McGriff navigated this delicate balance with precision, integrating financial management with operational oversight and psychological strategy. His approach demonstrated that true power in the streets was not merely about immediate gains but about the sustainable orchestration of influence, perception, and authority. The integration of wealth into strategic influence also allowed McGriff to expand his operational flexibility. Resources could be allocated dynamically to respond to challenges, seize opportunities, or reinforce emerging alliances. This adaptability reinforced his position, allowing him to maintain control over a growing network while minimizing exposure to risk. Wealth became a tool for both reinforcement and deterrence, a means of projecting authority and shaping outcomes without the need for constant direct intervention. Through this sophisticated integration of finance, psychology, and strategy, McGriff ensured that his influence was both resilient and enduring. By the mid-1990s, McGriff's empire was characterized by a remarkable coherence between its financial, operational, and social components. Cash flow, logistical systems, and human networks were all coordinated with precision, creating a resilient structure capable of withstanding both internal and external pressures. The careful management of money reinforced loyalty, extended influence, and projected authority, while the subtle calibration of perception ensured that rivals understood the limits of challenge and the advantages of alignment. In this environment, McGriff's influence was not merely localized, it was pervasive, shaping the dynamics of Queens' underworld with quiet but undeniable authority. Ultimately, McGriff's mastery of financial influence illustrates the depth of his strategic approach. Wealth was not an end in itself but a tool to secure loyalty, consolidate authority, and extend operational reach. By integrating financial management with social influence, operational oversight, and psychological insight, he constructed an empire that was resilient, adaptive, and far-reaching. In the streets of Queens, this combination of wealth, strategy, and perception created an environment in which his authority was acknowledged, his networks were disciplined, and his power extended seamlessly across neighborhoods. The careful orchestration of money, influence, and perception became a defining feature of McGriff's rise, cementing his status as the Emperor of Queens and setting the stage for the next phase of his story. Despite the expanding reach of Supreme McGriff's empire in Queens, the environment he operated within was never static. The growth of influence and wealth inevitably attracted attention, not only from potential allies but also from rivals eager to stake their claim. The streets of Queens, a complex mosaic of neighborhoods, allegiances, and unspoken codes, were rife with tension. For McGriff, the challenge was not merely in maintaining control over his operations but in managing the constantly shifting landscape of loyalty and rivalry. Even a minor misstep, a moment of misjudgment, or the wrong word whispered in the wrong ear could ignite conflicts with long-lasting consequences. As his network expanded, subtle cracks in alliances began to emerge. Associates who had once been steadfast showed signs of impatience or ambition, weighing personal gain against loyalty. McGriff recognized early that the stability of his operations depended on anticipating such fractures and addressing them before they could escalate. Observing human behavior became as critical as managing product or finances. As Supreme McGriff's influence grew across Queens, the attention of law enforcement began to intensify. What had once been a series of quiet, localized operations now represented a significant footprint in the borough's criminal landscape, and the authorities took notice. Surveillance became more pronounced, informants were cultivated, and investigators pieced together networks that had once been obscured by discretion and careful management. McGriff understood that with growth came scrutiny, and he adapted his methods accordingly. The presence of federal agents, local police, and undercover operatives introduced a subtle tension into daily operations, a constant awareness that even the smallest misstep could have serious consequences. Yet he maintained a calm, methodical approach, balancing the need for operational success with the imperative of security. The process of law enforcement attention was gradual but relentless. Investigators monitored patterns of activity, traced financial flows, and sought connections between seemingly isolated incidents. McGriff's network, while disciplined and carefully managed, was not invisible, and the complexity of his operations began to draw the interest of those whose role was to protect the public and enforce the law. This scrutiny introduced a new layer of risk, requiring constant vigilance and adaptive strategy. He understood that survival in this environment demanded foresight, discretion, and the ability to anticipate moves both from rivals and from those operating in uniform. Each action, each transaction, and each communication had to be calibrated against potential exposure. In response to these pressures, McGriff emphasized operational security. Communications were controlled, movements were monitored, and trust within his crew was constantly assessed. Associates understood that the presence of law enforcement necessitated discretion, and protocols were established to minimize risk. This careful approach allowed McGriff to continue operations while avoiding immediate detection, reinforcing his reputation as both intelligent and disciplined. The ability to adapt under pressure, to anticipate potential vulnerabilities, and to implement preventative measures became central to his leadership, and it distinguished him from others whose operations collapsed under scrutiny. Observation and intelligence gathering were not limited to rivals, they extended to law enforcement as well. McGriff recognized patterns in police activity, understood the timing of patrols, and noted the behaviors of investigators who sought to infiltrate or disrupt his network. This awareness allowed him to adjust operations, manage exposure, and mitigate potential risks. He applied the same strategic thinking to these interactions as he did to alliances and rivalries, treating law enforcement not simply as a threat but as a dynamic variable in a larger equation of influence, survival, and control. His capacity to anticipate and adapt became a defining feature of his expanding empire. The psychological dimension of law enforcement scrutiny was also significant. The awareness that investigators were watching, gathering information, and waiting for an opportunity created subtle pressures within his network. Associates were conscious of the risks, and their behavior was influenced by the presence of external observation. McGriff understood that the perception of oversight could be as powerful as actual intervention, and he leveraged this awareness to maintain discipline and cohesion. Subtle adjustments in operations, communication, and delegation were implemented to reinforce both efficiency and security, ensuring that the network remained resilient even under heightened scrutiny. Financial operations required particular attention. The movement of cash, investment of profits, and management of resources were all subject to potential observation and investigation. McGriff employed strategies to obscure direct connections, control access, and monitor the handling of funds. These measures were designed to minimize exposure while preserving operational efficiency, allowing the network to function effectively even as scrutiny increased. The discipline with which he approached financial management reflected not only intelligence but also foresight, understanding that vulnerabilities in this area could compromise the broader stability of his empire. Interactions with rivals and allies were similarly influenced by the awareness of law enforcement presence. Negotiations, territory disputes, and internal conflicts were managed with an eye toward minimizing exposure while maximizing strategic advantage. McGriff's ability to navigate these complex dynamics was enhanced by his deep understanding of human behavior, loyalty, and risk. He anticipated reactions, calibrated responses, and maintained an equilibrium that allowed operations to continue without unnecessary confrontation or detection. This integration of strategic psychology with operational management became increasingly critical as the scale and visibility of his empire expanded. Even routine activities required constant vigilance. Simple movements through neighborhoods, meetings with associates, and transactions were undertaken with an awareness of potential observation. McGriff implemented protocols to manage risk, ensuring that each operation was executed with precision and discretion. This discipline, while subtle, reinforced the stability and cohesion of his network. Associates internalized these expectations, understanding that operational security was a shared responsibility, and that their actions contributed directly to the resilience and longevity of the empire. The culture of vigilance became embedded in daily operations, strengthening both efficiency and influence. The presence of law enforcement also introduced an element of psychological tension that McGriff managed with subtlety. Awareness of surveillance, undercover operations, and investigative interest required careful consideration in every decision. He maintained calm, projecting confidence and control even under pressure, demonstrating that authority was not diminished by external observation. This psychological poise, combined with operational discipline, reinforced loyalty among associates and deterred potential challengers. The ability to operate effectively under scrutiny became a hallmark of his leadership, showcasing both intelligence and resilience in a high-stakes environment. Strategic adaptation extended to the broader operational landscape. McGriff recognized that the dynamic interaction of law enforcement, rivals, and internal networks required continuous assessment and adjustment. Shifts in tactics, temporary reallocation of resources, and careful timing of activities allowed him to maintain influence while mitigating exposure. Each decision was informed by both immediate operational needs and long-term strategic objectives, ensuring that his empire remained resilient despite external pressures. The integration of foresight, observation, and tactical management allowed him to navigate a landscape that was both complex and perilous. The early 1990s thus became a period in which McGriff's abilities as a strategist, leader, and observer were tested in new ways. The attention of law enforcement introduced both risk and opportunity, requiring the adaptation of methods, reinforcement of networks, and careful management of perception. McGriff's capacity to integrate operational oversight, psychological insight, and strategic planning allowed him to maintain dominance in Queens despite increasing scrutiny. His network continued to function with precision, loyalty was reinforced, and influence extended across neighborhoods. The subtle balance between visibility, discretion, and control became a defining feature of his empire, and his ability to navigate this tension solidified his reputation as a formidable figure in the borough. Through this period, McGriff demonstrated that true authority in Queens was not derived solely from violence, charisma, or wealth, but from a combination of strategic foresight, operational discipline, and psychological acuity. He managed the pressures of law enforcement attention with calm precision, adapting methods, reinforcing loyalty, and projecting influence in ways that preserved both stability and growth. The attention of the authorities, while a potential threat, became another variable in his carefully managed landscape, a factor to be anticipated and integrated into the ongoing exercise of control. In this way, his leadership and strategic mastery continued to expand the reach and resilience of his empire, setting the stage for both the challenges and triumphs that lay ahead. As Supreme McGriff's influence and empire expanded, the internal dynamics of his organization became increasingly complex. Loyalty, once a simple expectation, now required careful cultivation and constant monitoring. Ambition, human nature, and the pressures of external scrutiny meant that every relationship within his network was dynamic, requiring attention and strategic management. McGriff understood that even the most loyal associates could be tempted by opportunity, fear, or personal grievances. The stability of his empire depended on his ability to navigate these subtleties, balancing encouragement, oversight, and subtle intimidation to ensure that cohesion remained intact. The exercise of leadership in this context was as much psychological as operational, a continuous calibration of trust, respect, and influence. Internal conflicts, though often subtle, could ripple outward and destabilize operations if left unaddressed. McGriff observed interactions closely, noting hesitation, discontent, or subtle acts that suggested wavering allegiance. These signals were not always overt. A tone of voice, a delayed response, or a minor disagreement could indicate a fracture in loyalty that, if ignored, could escalate. He approached these moments with a calm, deliberate strategy, employing observation, subtle redirection, and quiet reinforcement of expectations. Rather than reacting impulsively, he allowed patterns to reveal themselves, intervening with precision when necessary to reinforce cohesion and trust. This measured approach maintained stability while cultivating a culture in which loyalty and competence were consistently rewarded. The interplay of loyalty and ambition within his organization was particularly delicate. Associates were motivated by a mixture of respect, self-interest, and aspiration, each weighing the benefits of alignment with McGriff against personal gain. He understood these motivations intimately, shaping incentives and consequences to align personal ambitions with the objectives of the broader network. Assigning responsibility, rewarding competence, and occasionally signaling the costs of missteps became tools to reinforce a collective sense of purpose. In this way, he transformed individual ambition into a mechanism for operational strength, ensuring that the energy and initiative of his associates contributed to the stability and expansion of his empire. Strategic intervention was a hallmark of McGriff's leadership style. When tensions or disagreements arose, he addressed them with careful timing and subtlety, avoiding public confrontation or unnecessary disruption. These interventions were often psychological, leveraging perception and influence rather than force. Associates were reminded of the broader objectives, the value of cohesion, and the implicit consequences of disloyalty. By managing conflicts in this manner, McGriff maintained both authority and respect, reinforcing his role as a leader whose guidance was both necessary and appreciated. This approach minimized internal disruption while strengthening the bonds of loyalty and shared purpose within the organization. Communication within the network was critical. McGriff established channels that allowed information to flow efficiently while maintaining discretion. Associates were expected to report key developments, share observations, and flag potential issues, creating a feedback loop that informed strategic decisions. At the same time, information was carefully controlled to prevent misuse, misinterpretation, or leaks. This disciplined approach to communication ensured that the organization could respond to both internal and external challenges effectively, maintaining operational stability while reinforcing hierarchical structure and trust. The subtle management of perception extended beyond the immediate network. McGriff was acutely aware that external observers, rivals, community members, and law enforcement, were influenced by visible signs of cohesion and authority. Internal disputes, if left unchecked, could undermine the perception of strength and invite challenges. By addressing conflicts quietly, strategically, and effectively, he projected an image of control that reinforced both loyalty and deterrence. Associates internalized this model, recognizing that stability was both a practical necessity and a reflection of the discipline and foresight required to operate under his leadership. Mentorship and personal guidance were also integral to cultivating loyalty. McGriff invested in the development of his associates, providing advice, strategic insight and opportunities for growth. By demonstrating competence, fairness, and foresight, he reinforced a culture in which alignment with the organization was both rewarding and personally enriching. This approach created a sense of investment and identification within the network, strengthening bonds of loyalty while simultaneously enhancing operational capability. Associates learned not only the mechanics of operations but also the subtleties of strategy, psychology, and influence, extending McGriff's leadership through their actions and decisions. Observation remained central to the maintenance of internal cohesion. McGriff continuously monitored the behavior of his associates, noting patterns that suggested reliability, initiative, or potential vulnerability. This vigilance was not intrusive but rather a calibrated awareness, allowing him to anticipate challenges, identify opportunities, and reinforce desired behaviors. By integrating observation with strategic intervention, mentorship, and incentive structures, he maintained a network that was both disciplined and adaptive, capable of responding to external pressures without losing cohesion. The organization became a reflection of his strategic mind, a system in which both human and operational elements were harmonized to maintain influence and stability. The balance of trust, loyalty, and accountability was reinforced through subtle mechanisms. Recognition of competence, allocation of responsibility, and careful calibration of consequences created a culture in which associates understood both the value of alignment and the cost of missteps. McGriff's leadership combined reward and subtle deterrence, creating an environment in which internal ambition was harnessed for the benefit of the collective organization. This equilibrium allowed the network to function efficiently, withstand pressure, and maintain resilience even as external threats and rivalries intensified. External pressures, from rival factions to law enforcement scrutiny, further tested the cohesion of McGriff's organization. He recognized that internal discord under such conditions could have cascading effects, potentially compromising operations or exposing vulnerabilities. By maintaining a disciplined, psychologically aware approach to internal management, he mitigated these risks. The organization was structured to adapt to challenges, anticipate threats, and maintain continuity of operations, demonstrating a remarkable integration of human management, strategic foresight, and operational discipline. Associates internalized the importance of loyalty, perception, and alignment, contributing to a resilient and stable network. The rising complexity of McGriff's operations highlighted the necessity of leadership that was both firm and flexible. Internal tensions, rival ambitions, and the unpredictable nature of human behavior required a combination of observation, intervention, and strategic guidance. McGriff's ability to navigate these dynamics reinforced his authority while maintaining operational stability. Loyalty was earned and cultivated, ambition was directed toward shared objectives, and internal disputes were managed with subtlety and foresight. The organization, in this period, functioned as a cohesive unit, capable of responding to both internal and external challenges while maintaining the integrity of the network. Ultimately, the management of loyalty and fragility within the organization was central to McGriff's success. He recognized that influence and power were sustained not merely through fear or wealth but through the careful orchestration of human relationships, trust, and perception. By monitoring behavior, addressing conflicts strategically, and fostering a culture of competence and reliability, he maintained cohesion across a growing and complex network. This careful balance between discipline, psychological insight, and operational oversight allowed his empire to function effectively, reinforcing his authority and ensuring that the organization remained resilient in the face of both internal tensions and external pressures. In this way, loyalty was both cultivated and safeguarded, forming a cornerstone of McGriff's enduring influence in Queens. By the early 1990s, Supreme McGriff's operations had reached a scale that few could rival in Queens. What had once been small, discrete transactions on street corners and in dimly lit apartments had grown into a network that spanned multiple neighborhoods, weaving together distribution, enforcement, and strategic alliances with precision. His empire, quietly but steadily, had become a structured system, in which the flow of product, money, and information was orchestrated to maintain both efficiency and discretion. It was during this period that the crack cocaine trade in Queens reached its peak, and McGriff's name had begun to resonate not only among associates and rivals but throughout the borough, whispered in cautious tones as a man whose influence was undeniable. At the height of his operations, McGriff demonstrated a mastery of coordination that few contemporaries could match. Each element of his enterprise was managed with a focus on reliability and continuity. Distribution channels were mapped with careful attention, ensuring that product reached the right locations at the right time, with trusted associates overseeing critical nodes. Surveillance of operations was constant but discreet, a methodical observation that minimized exposure while maximizing control. Communication within his network was both precise and secure, allowing for rapid adaptation without compromising secrecy. This level of operational sophistication reflected a deep understanding of both logistics and human behavior, highlighting the combination of strategic foresight and psychological insight that had become the hallmark of his leadership. The psychological component of McGriff's operations was as important as the material. Associates were selected not only for their capabilities but for their temperament, loyalty, and capacity to operate under pressure. Training, guidance, and mentorship were woven into daily interactions, reinforcing both skill and trust. Mistakes were addressed subtly but decisively, reinforcing standards without disrupting cohesion. By managing the human element with care, McGriff ensured that each part of his empire functioned harmoniously, creating a network that was both resilient and responsive. The confidence inspired by his leadership extended beyond immediate associates, influencing the behavior of rivals, community members, and even casual observers who sensed the reach and authority of his operations. Territorial control was another crucial aspect of his peak operations. McGriff understood that dominance in Queens required not only operational proficiency but also the strategic management of space and influence. Certain neighborhoods, corners, and buildings became essential nodes in his network, carefully monitored and coordinated. These locations were managed with precision, balancing the demands of accessibility, visibility, and security. Associates were entrusted with oversight, and protocols were in place to manage disputes, prevent encroachment, and maintain order. Through this careful management of territory, McGriff extended both practical and psychological control, reinforcing his authority and ensuring the smooth functioning of operations across a broad geographic area. Financial management at this stage of McGriff's empire had become an intricate system. The scale of revenue required disciplined oversight, allocation, and reinvestment. Funds were carefully distributed to maintain operations, reward loyalty, and strategically expand influence. By integrating financial strategy with operational and human management, McGriff ensured that his empire remained sustainable, adaptable, and resilient. The subtle use of money as both an incentive and a tool for influence reinforced loyalty, established credibility, and signaled authority to allies and rivals alike. Wealth, when wielded strategically, amplified both operational capacity and psychological impact, solidifying McGriff's position at the apex of the Queen's drug trade. Conflict management remained a continuous challenge, even at the peak of his empire. Rival factions, ambitious associates, and the unpredictable nature of human behavior required constant attention. McGriff's approach was both preventative and responsive. Potential conflicts were anticipated through careful observation and strategic communication. When disputes arose, interventions were calculated, measured, and designed to preserve cohesion while reinforcing authority. Violence was a tool of last resort, employed only when necessary to maintain control or defend critical operations. The combination of foresight, subtle influence, and selective action allowed him to maintain stability in an environment where volatility was constant and stakes were high. The scale of operations at this peak required McGriff to balance multiple layers of influence simultaneously. He managed not only the immediate network of associates but also relationships with rival operators, community figures, and intermediaries who impacted the functioning of his empire. Each relationship was assessed for strategic value, loyalty, and potential risk. Decision-making was informed by observation, experience, and a careful weighing of long-term consequences. By integrating these various layers, McGriff ensured that his operations could function effectively even under the pressure of external scrutiny, rival encroachment, and the inherent volatility of the streets. At the apex of his operations, McGriff's reputation had become both a shield and a tool. His strategic intelligence, operational discipline, and subtle mastery of intimidation created an aura that extended far beyond his immediate circle. Allies were motivated by respect and loyalty, rivals approached with caution, and the broader community became aware of a presence that was influential even in absence. Reputation, carefully cultivated and reinforced through both action and perception, amplified the effectiveness of his network. The psychological weight of his name became a force multiplier, shaping decisions, deterring challenges, and maintaining order across a complex urban environment. At the height of his operations, Supreme McGriff's life was defined by a constant tension between power and risk, opportunity and consequence. The streets of Queens, once merely a training ground, had become a complex stage on which he balanced multiple competing forces. While his empire was at its most expansive, the stakes were higher than ever, and the consequences of miscalculation were magnified. Violence, though not always overt, was an ever-present undercurrent, a reminder that authority in the underworld required both strategic intelligence and the occasional demonstration of force. For McGriff, this was the delicate art of managing influence, maintaining dominance without provoking unnecessary conflict, reinforcing loyalty without inviting betrayal, and projecting power without overexposure. The tension was particularly acute in the enforcement and security of his empire. Maintaining control over distribution networks, associates, and territory required vigilance and decisive action when challenges arose. McGriff understood that stability depended not just on strategic foresight but also on the careful management of human behavior. Associates had to be reliable, rivals had to be deterred, and communities had to recognize boundaries of influence without prompting overt resistance. Each decision carried both immediate and long-term implications. A poorly timed intervention could spark conflict, hesitation could embolden rivals, misjudged intimidation could alienate allies. McGriff's ability to calibrate every action carefully was central to sustaining the empire's peak operations. Violence, when it occurred, was often precise and calculated rather than impulsive. McGriff recognized that unnecessary aggression could destabilize relationships, attract law enforcement attention, or erode the perception of his strategic intelligence. He employed force as a tool of last resort, using it to enforce rules, deter rivals, and safeguard critical operations. Even these acts were executed with an understanding of their psychological impact, reinforcing his reputation while maintaining operational integrity. Associates and observers alike learned that while McGriff's authority was rarely challenged without consequence, it was measured, deliberate, and underpinned by strategy rather than mere impulse. The psychological landscape of his empire was as crucial as the physical control of territory and product. McGriff understood that influence extended beyond direct interactions. Perception, reputation, and subtle intimidation were powerful tools. Rivals approached cautiously, unsure of when intervention might occur. Allies remained aligned, motivated by both respect and recognition of competence. Community members, even those not directly involved in operations, recognized patterns of control, stability, and authority. The combination of observable discipline, strategic action, and subtle signaling created an ecosystem in which McGriff's influence extended organically, shaping behavior, deterring challenges, and reinforcing loyalty. At the operational level, coordination and oversight became increasingly complex. With multiple distribution points, a growing number of associates, and expanding territories, McGriff relied on structured systems to maintain efficiency and security. Each associate had defined responsibilities, contingency plans were in place for disruptions, and communication channels allowed for rapid response to evolving situations. This operational discipline ensured that even under the pressure of rival threats or law enforcement scrutiny, the empire remained resilient. The blend of human management, logistical oversight, and strategic foresight allowed McGriff to sustain peak operations without exposing critical vulnerabilities. The expansion of influence brought inevitable rivalry and competition. Other operators sought to challenge McGriff's dominance, encroach upon territory, or exploit perceived weaknesses. McGriff approached these threats with strategic intelligence, assessing risk, observing behavior, and responding with subtle measures of deterrence. Negotiation, intimidation, and selective confrontation were all employed to maintain authority without escalating conflict unnecessarily. He understood that reputation was a force multiplier. The perception of readiness, decisiveness, and foresight could often achieve results without direct action. Rivals quickly learned that McGriff's decisions were deliberate and outcomes were often inevitable, reinforcing caution and deference. Loyalty within his organization remained a central concern. Associates were motivated by a combination of respect, ambition, and practical gain, each evaluating alignment with McGriff against personal objectives. Maintaining cohesion required careful attention, observation, and reinforcement of norms. Competence was recognized and rewarded, missteps were addressed with discretion, and loyalty was cultivated through mentorship, opportunity, and subtle psychological influence. By managing these internal dynamics carefully, McGriff ensured that the network remained resilient, disciplined, and capable of responding effectively to external pressures, even at the height of expansion. Law enforcement scrutiny intensified alongside the growth of McGriff's empire. Surveillance, undercover operations, and investigative focus created an additional layer of complexity. McGriff's response was one of calm adaptation. Operational protocols were adjusted, sensitive communications were controlled, and associates were continuously reminded of the importance of discretion. Awareness of potential observation influenced decision-making, timing, and allocation of resources. By integrating this layer of risk into operational planning, McGriff maintained the resilience of his empire, demonstrating that intelligence and foresight were as important as force or wealth in sustaining power. The management of territory, finances, and human resources intersected to create a highly structured system of influence. McGriff ensured that product distribution was precise, cash flow was controlled, and associates operated within clearly defined parameters. Contingency plans mitigated risk, and protocols reinforced discipline. At the same time, psychological influence extended beyond formal structures, leveraging reputation, subtle intimidation, and perception to maintain dominance. The integration of these elements allowed McGriff to exercise authority effectively, reinforcing loyalty, deterring opposition, and maintaining cohesion across multiple layers of his organization. As the peak of his empire unfolded, McGriff's influence was both practical and symbolic. The streets of Queens reflected his reach, rivals approached cautiously, associates operated with discipline, and communities acknowledged boundaries of control without overt confrontation. Violence, while present, was applied with precision, reinforcing rules and deterring transgression rather than creating chaos. Financial management, operational coordination, and psychological influence worked in concert to sustain a stable and resilient network. McGriff's ability to integrate these dimensions of power highlighted the sophistication of his leadership, demonstrating that dominance was maintained through strategy, observation, and careful calibration rather than brute force alone. The apex of McGriff's operations also revealed the human cost of such influence. Constant vigilance, the pressure to maintain cohesion, and the need to anticipate threats created a psychological weight that required careful management. He had to balance ambition with prudence, authority with loyalty, and influence with discretion. The decisions he made carried consequences not only for himself but for associates, rivals, and the broader community. The careful orchestration of these elements became both a test and a demonstration of his capacity for strategic leadership, reinforcing the perception of inevitability and reinforcing his moniker as the Emperor of Queens. In this period, McGriff's empire exemplified the delicate interplay of power, psychology, and strategy. He managed relationships, territory, operations, and perception with a level of sophistication that extended influence without unnecessary exposure. Loyalty was cultivated, rivals were deterred, and operations functioned with precision. Violence was applied selectively, reputation was leveraged strategically, and the human dimension of authority was integrated seamlessly into operational oversight. The streets of Queens became both a landscape of commerce and a stage for subtle demonstrations of control, in which the balance of power was maintained with careful observation, foresight, and measured action. Ultimately, the peak of McGriff's operations demonstrated that authority in the underworld was as much about intelligence, discipline, and perception as it was about product or money. The empire he constructed was resilient, adaptive, and psychologically reinforced, reflecting a mastery of human behavior, operational logistics, and strategic planning. Even as tensions, rivalries, and external pressures persisted, McGriff maintained dominance with calm precision, ensuring that his influence extended across neighborhoods, associates, and even the perception of the broader community. In this way, the peak of his empire represented not only the culmination of operational success but also the embodiment of strategic mastery, subtle influence, and the careful orchestration of power. As Supreme McGriff's empire reached its zenith, the attention of law enforcement intensified with increasing focus and sophistication. What had once been localized surveillance and casual investigation now transformed into a coordinated effort by local police, federal agents, and the Drug Enforcement Administration. McGriff understood that growth carried visibility, and with visibility came scrutiny that could not be ignored. Surveillance cameras, wiretaps, informants, and undercover operatives began to map the contours of his operations with painstaking precision. Even minor errors in communication or routine activities could be observed, catalogued, and used as evidence. This pressure, subtle yet omnipresent, added a new layer of complexity to the daily management of his empire, demanding calm, foresight, and disciplined adaptation. The methods employed by law enforcement were methodical. Investigators tracked the flow of money, monitored distribution networks, and developed profiles of key associates. They sought patterns in otherwise ordinary interactions, piecing together a picture that had previously been obscured by discretion and operational efficiency. McGriff, acutely aware of these efforts, integrated this awareness into his strategic calculus. Decisions about movement, meeting locations, communications, and operational timing were now informed by an understanding of external scrutiny. Every action, no matter how routine, was evaluated for risk, ensuring that exposure was minimized and the integrity of the network maintained. Operational security became paramount. McGriff implemented protocols to manage the flow of information within his organization. Associates were trained in the subtleties of discretion, who to trust, when to speak, and how to avoid leaving traces that could compromise the network. Communication channels were monitored, encrypted, and restricted according to operational necessity. These practices created a culture of vigilance, reinforcing both trust and responsibility among his associates. Each member understood that the survival and prosperity of the empire depended on the disciplined execution of these protocols, and the result was a network capable of operating efficiently even under the increasing pressure of investigation. The psychological impact of heightened law enforcement scrutiny extended beyond operations to human behavior. McGriff was keenly aware of the effect that awareness of surveillance had on both allies and rivals. Associates often exhibited subtle signs of tension, hesitation, or hypervigilance, reflecting the constant awareness of external observation. McGriff leveraged this understanding to reinforce discipline, manage expectations, and maintain cohesion. By subtly influencing behavior through training, expectation setting, and strategic observation, he ensured that the network remained resilient, efficient, and psychologically aligned even under stress. The careful balance of oversight, guidance, and strategic autonomy became a defining feature of leadership under pressure. Financial operations required particular adaptation in response to law enforcement attention. Cash flow, resource allocation, and reinvestment became high-stakes undertakings, as investigators sought to trace transactions and identify patterns. McGriff introduced safeguards and redundancies, compartmentalizing operations to minimize exposure. Funds were moved with discretion, and oversight mechanisms were established to monitor compliance and prevent leaks. These strategies ensured that operations continued smoothly while maintaining security and operational continuity. The integration of financial management with operational oversight, human supervision, and strategic foresight exemplified the sophistication of McGriff's approach in navigating complex challenges. Territorial control and alliance management were similarly influenced by external scrutiny. Rivals could exploit signs of vulnerability, and the presence of law enforcement created additional constraints on movement, negotiation, and territorial enforcement. McGriff adapted by reinforcing communication, deploying trusted associates to monitor critical areas, and maintaining a subtle but consistent demonstration of authority. By balancing operational efficiency with vigilance, he was able to project control and influence without provoking unnecessary attention. The perception of stability, competence, and discipline became both a protective shield and a strategic tool, reinforcing his dominance while minimizing risk. The pressure of external investigation also required adaptive leadership in response to human behavior. Associates faced increased stress under surveillance and scrutiny, which could result in errors, miscommunication, or lapses in judgment. McGriff's approach emphasized observation, mentorship, and subtle reinforcement of standards. He intervened selectively to correct behavior, reinforce loyalty, and provide strategic guidance. These interventions were measured, often invisible to those outside the organization, yet highly effective in maintaining operational integrity. By managing the human dimension alongside operational and financial aspects, McGriff sustained cohesion and resilience even in a high-risk, high-pressure environment. Law enforcement strategies evolved, employing both traditional investigative techniques and emerging technologies to monitor, infiltrate, and disrupt operations. McGriff adapted by integrating countermeasures into his operational planning. Surveillance of associates, encrypted communications, and controlled exposure to potential informants reduced the likelihood of compromise. Strategic redundancy ensured that even if individual nodes were exposed, the broader network remained functional. These proactive measures were evidence of McGriff's strategic foresight and his understanding of the interplay between risk, perception, and operational continuity. Authority, influence, and survival were maintained through anticipation, adaptation, and calculated discretion. The combination of operational, psychological, and financial management allowed McGriff to maintain influence even under the growing weight of scrutiny. Associates internalized the expectations of discretion, loyalty, and competence, contributing to a disciplined culture that reinforced the resilience of the network. Rivals, aware of the careful orchestration and adaptability of operations, approached with caution, often deferring to McGriff's authority rather than challenging it directly. Law enforcement, despite increased pressure and strategic effort, faced a network structure to withstand scrutiny, operate efficiently, and adapt to shifting conditions. This balance of perception, discipline, and operational flexibility became a defining hallmark of his leadership during this period. Even mundane activities were imbued with strategy under this scrutiny. Meetings, financial transactions, and territorial adjustments were conducted with awareness of potential observation. Timing, location, and participant selection were calibrated to minimize risk and maximize efficiency. McGriff's attention to these details ensured that operations remained cohesive and resilient, while projecting an image of discipline and authority that reinforced both internal and external perceptions. Each decision was informed by a combination of operational experience, strategic foresight, and psychological understanding, demonstrating a level of sophistication that few contemporaries could match. Ultimately, this period of heightened law enforcement attention tested and refined McGriff's leadership. He demonstrated that authority, influence, and operational resilience were sustained not only through wealth or intimidation but through disciplined strategy, foresight, and subtle management of human behavior. His empire continued to function, adapt, and maintain dominance even under scrutiny, reinforcing both his reputation and the stability of his operations. By integrating operational oversight, financial discipline, and psychological influence, McGriff navigated the pressures of external investigation while continuing to expand his influence, leaving an indelible mark on Queens' criminal landscape. Even the most carefully constructed empires, no matter how disciplined, face moments when fortune shifts and vulnerability becomes unavoidable. For Supreme McGriff, this turning point arrived as the combined pressures of law enforcement scrutiny, rival ambitions, and subtle cracks within his own network began to converge. His operations, once executed with near-flawless precision, became increasingly exposed to the vigilance of federal investigators, local police, and informants embedded within the streets of Queens. The very success that had allowed his influence to expand now carried with it heightened risk. Every transaction, every meeting, and every decision was scrutinized, not just by his associates and rivals but by an entire apparatus determined to dismantle his carefully constructed empire. The process of arrest began not with sudden violence but with a series of subtle interventions, calculated moves designed to neutralize him without triggering immediate chaos. Surveillance captured patterns of movement, while carefully placed informants provided details of internal dynamics and operational procedures. McGriff, though experienced and highly strategic, was confronted with the reality that even the most disciplined systems could be penetrated. His response remained calm and measured, attempting to adjust operations, manage associates, and contain exposure. Yet the forces arrayed against him were systematic, methodical, and relentless, demonstrating that even brilliance in the streets could be challenged by persistent, patient scrutiny. Internal loyalty, which had long been a strength of his organization, became a point of vulnerability. Associates faced intense pressure from both law enforcement and rival influences, creating an environment where trust was tested. McGriff recognized early on that survival would depend on reinforcing cohesion, maintaining discipline, and ensuring that critical nodes within the network remained reliable. He deployed strategies to maintain communication, assess loyalty, and recalibrate assignments to minimize risk. These interventions were subtle, often invisible to those outside the inner circle, yet crucial to maintaining stability amid rising pressure. Even so, the inevitability of exposure loomed, creating a palpable tension within the network. The arrest itself, when it finally occurred, was executed with precision and overwhelming force. Federal agents and local authorities coordinated to ensure that McGriff could be taken into custody without immediate disruption to the broader investigation. The operation, though swift, was the culmination of months of surveillance, intelligence gathering, and strategic planning by law enforcement. For McGriff, the moment marked the first major crack in what had appeared to be an unassailable empire. The meticulous organization, the careful management of loyalty, and the calculated exercise of influence had delayed the inevitable, but they could not prevent the consequences of external pressures converging with the inherent vulnerabilities of any human system. The immediate aftermath of his arrest was a period of uncertainty and reflection, both for McGriff and for the network he had constructed. Associates, previously disciplined and coordinated, faced the challenge of maintaining operations without direct guidance. Rivals observed opportunities for encroachment, testing boundaries that had once been firmly under his control. Law enforcement sought to leverage his absence to gather additional intelligence and consolidate evidence. McGriff, despite confinement, understood that the influence he had cultivated could extend beyond his physical presence, and he began to strategize ways to maintain authority, communicate directives, and preserve the cohesion of his organization from behind bars. The legal process introduced another layer of complexity. Indictments, charges, and investigations created uncertainty, requiring McGriff to adapt not only to the loss of freedom but also to the scrutiny of the judicial system. Court appearances, legal counsel, and negotiation with prosecutors became as critical as street-level decision-making. His strategic mind, honed over years of navigating human behavior and operational logistics, now had to navigate legal procedures, evidence, and the timing of judicial outcomes. The psychological and operational skills that had allowed him to maintain dominance on the streets were repurposed to sustain influence within a highly constrained and formalized environment. Even in custody, McGriff's presence was felt through the networks he had built. Associates remained disciplined, executing routines, managing operations, and preserving loyalty, albeit under greater pressure and scrutiny. Communication channels were carefully managed, and information flow was controlled to maintain operational stability. McGriff's reputation and prior discipline served as both a shield and a stabilizing force, reminding associates and rivals alike that his influence extended beyond immediate physical control. The structural resilience of his empire, built on careful human management, operational discipline, and psychological insight, allowed it to endure even as external pressures intensified. The human dimension of his arrest was profound. The psychological impact on associates, family, and community members highlighted the deep interconnection between leadership, loyalty, and perception. Fear, uncertainty, and speculation were pervasive, yet McGriff's calm, strategic presence continued to exert influence. Associates internalize the lessons of his leadership, anticipate threats, maintain discipline, and respect both operational and relational hierarchies. In this way, the arrest, while a significant disruption, did not immediately dismantle the carefully constructed systems of influence he had established over years of strategic growth. Reflection became a necessary part of McGriff's adaptation. Confined physically but not mentally, he evaluated the sequence of events leading to his arrest, the vulnerabilities that had been exploited, and the potential for long-term resilience. He considered both operational and human factors, how networks functioned under pressure, where loyalty was tested, and how perception influenced behavior. This introspection allowed him to recalibrate strategies, maintain psychological influence, and prepare for both immediate legal challenges and the longer-term implications of imprisonment. His ability to adapt, anticipate, and strategize under constrained circumstances highlighted the depth of his intelligence and the resilience of his leadership. Even as legal proceedings advanced, McGriff's influence in Queens remained significant. The reputation he had cultivated, the loyalty he had instilled, and the operational systems he had established continued to shape the behavior of associates, rivals, and community members. While physical control was limited, the psychological and structural components of his empire endured. His arrest served as both a disruption and a demonstration. Even in confinement, the careful orchestration of loyalty, perception, and influence ensured that his presence remained a force to be reckoned with. The culmination of this period marked a significant turning point. The arrest signaled the vulnerability inherent in even the most disciplined and strategically managed empires. McGriff's experience underscored the delicate interplay of human behavior, operational management, and external pressures. While dominance could be achieved through foresight, discipline, and strategic influence, it could also be challenged and disrupted by coordinated observation, intelligence, and intervention. This moment, though deeply disruptive, also highlighted the sophistication of his leadership, the resilience of his networks, and the enduring impact of his strategic intelligence. Ultimately, McGriff's arrest represented both a downfall and a testament to his capabilities. The empire he had built over years of careful observation, disciplined management, and strategic foresight had reached a scale that drew attention and provoked action. The challenges of loyalty, rivalries, operational coordination, and law enforcement scrutiny converged, demonstrating that even the most formidable figures are vulnerable to the pressures of external forces and the limitations of human systems. Yet the resilience of his networks, the loyalty of his associates, and the depth of his strategic acumen ensured that his influence would persist, echoing across the streets of Queens long after his physical presence had been constrained. This period marked the beginning of a transition, from dominance in the streets to navigating influence, authority, and legacy from behind bars, setting the stage for the complex interplay of power, reflection, and adaptation that would define the next chapter of his life. The period following Supreme McGriff's arrest introduced a new dimension to his life and influence, one that required adaptation to constraints he had never faced before. The streets of Queens, once under his near-complete oversight, continued to function, but now under the shadow of his physical absence. His empire, built meticulously over years of observation, alliances, and strategic foresight, was tested by the fragility inherent in human networks. Associates, once guided directly by his presence, had to navigate decisions with a combination of independence and loyalty, balancing operational responsibilities with the risks of external pressure from law enforcement, rival factions, and the unpredictable dynamics of the streets. This period marked the transition from hands-on control to the delicate management of influence from confinement. From the moment of his incarceration, McGriff understood that survival, and the continuation of his influence, required careful calibration. Direct action was no longer possible, yet the structures, loyalties, and perception he had cultivated could still be leveraged. He focused on maintaining the coherence of his organization, ensuring that associates adhered to operational protocols, communicated effectively, and preserved loyalty. Through intermediaries, carefully controlled messages, and the silent power of reputation, he continued to exert psychological authority over the network. Every decision he made had to be considered in terms of both immediate impact and long-term sustainability, with the knowledge that mistakes could reverberate beyond his immediate environment. Managing a network from confinement required a sophisticated understanding of human behavior. Associates were subject to the stress of increased responsibility, fear of exposure, and the temptations of personal gain. McGriff anticipated these pressures and integrated mechanisms of psychological influence into his communications and directives. Subtle guidance, strategic reinforcement, and the cultivation of respect were employed to ensure that loyalty remained intact. By emphasizing the importance of shared objectives and the consequences of missteps, he maintained a balance between autonomy and adherence to organizational norms, ensuring that operations continued smoothly despite his absence. External pressures continued to escalate. Rivals, aware of the vacuum created by his physical absence, tested boundaries, probing the edges of his influence and assessing the resilience of his network. Law enforcement, emboldened by the arrest, sought further intelligence, attempting to exploit vulnerabilities and dismantle residual operations. McGriff responded by integrating adaptability and foresight into his network's operations, ensuring that associates remained disciplined, resources were secured, and risks were mitigated. Each challenge was met with a combination of strategic calculation and psychological influence, reinforcing cohesion and resilience within the network. The legal process added additional layers of complexity. Court proceedings, potential plea deals, and ongoing investigations created uncertainty that extended beyond immediate operational concerns. McGriff had to navigate not only his personal circumstances but also the implications for the network and the perception of his authority. Strategic engagement with legal counsel, careful consideration of procedural options, and the management of information became essential. In this way, he applied the same methodical and analytical approach to the judicial environment as he had to operations in the streets, demonstrating an ability to translate strategic thinking across vastly different domains. Even mundane aspects of daily life in confinement required adaptation. Communication, movement within the facility, and interactions with other inmates and officials became variables that could influence both his psychological resilience and his ability to maintain authority externally. McGriff approached these dynamics with the same calm observation and strategic foresight that had guided his rise, understanding that perception was as critical in prison as it had been on the streets. Maintaining composure, signaling competence, and projecting stability became integral to preserving influence, even when direct control over operations was limited. Financial influence remained a critical component of sustaining his network. Although cash flow and direct transactions were constrained by incarceration, McGriff continued to leverage relationships and the residual structures of his operations to maintain stability. Intermediaries, trusted associates, and carefully managed channels allowed for the continuation of essential functions. Resources were allocated strategically to reinforce loyalty, secure operational nodes, and preserve the perception of authority. This integration of financial, psychological, and operational management ensured that the network retained cohesion despite the challenges imposed by confinement. The psychological impact of incarceration extended beyond McGriff himself to the broader network. Associates experienced both heightened responsibility and stress, while rivals observed opportunities and potential weaknesses. McGriff anticipated these dynamics, embedding resilience through mentorship, communication, and strategic reinforcement of loyalty. By emphasizing shared purpose and demonstrating continued oversight, he ensured that confidence and operational discipline remained intact. The subtle exercise of authority, maintained through perception and communication, allowed him to influence outcomes even in the absence of physical presence. Adaptation also required recalibration of risk and operational strategies. Actions that had been routine on the streets now carried amplified consequences, with exposure, errors, or betrayal posing significant threats to the continuity of influence. McGriff implemented contingency plans, prioritized key operational nodes, and ensured that associates were prepared to respond effectively to emerging threats. Observation, evaluation, and subtle intervention became ongoing processes, reinforcing discipline and minimizing vulnerability. In this way, the network was structured to withstand the pressures of internal and external forces, maintaining cohesion and operational integrity. The broader social and psychological landscape of Queens continued to interact with McGriff's influence. Residents, community members, and rival factions adjusted behavior in response to the knowledge of his incarceration, testing the limits of perceived authority. Yet the reputation, legacy, and residual control that McGriff had cultivated continued to exert a stabilizing influence. Boundaries were respected, alliances remained largely intact, and rival encroachment was measured. This extension of influence through perception, reputation, and structural resilience underscored the sophistication of his approach, demonstrating that authority in complex social systems could persist even in the absence of direct physical control. Ultimately, this period represented a profound test of McGriff's strategic intelligence, psychological acumen, and leadership resilience. The shift from physical dominance to influence mediated by intermediaries, perception, and disciplined structure required continuous adaptation. The ability to manage loyalty, anticipate threats, and maintain cohesion under the pressures of incarceration highlighted the depth of his leadership capabilities. His empire, though disrupted, continued to function, a testament to the systems, culture, and psychological influence he had cultivated over years of meticulous effort. The transition from hands-on control to strategic oversight within confinement marked a critical chapter, illustrating both the vulnerabilities and the enduring resilience of his power. Even in the quiet moments, confined within walls that limited movement and access, McGriff's mind remained a theater of strategy. He contemplated operational adjustments, anticipated the moves of rivals, and considered the psychological state of associates and observers alike. Every detail, from resource allocation to the subtle reinforcement of loyalty, was subject to calculation and foresight. The ability to maintain influence through observation, communication, and psychological leverage reflected a mastery of leadership that transcended physical constraints, emphasizing the enduring interplay of strategy, perception, and authority. In this period, the resilience of McGriff's empire highlighted the lasting impact of disciplined management, strategic foresight, and psychological influence. Though physically confined, his authority persisted through structured networks, loyal associates, and the perception of competence and inevitability. The streets of Queens, the operational nodes of his network, and the broader perception of his influence remained aligned with the legacy he had meticulously cultivated. In this way, incarceration became not only a moment of challenge but also a demonstration of the enduring reach of strategic intelligence, the resilience of loyalty, and the subtle exercise of authority even under profound constraint. Even while confined, Supreme McGriff remained acutely aware of the shifting landscape beyond the prison walls. The streets of Queens were no longer under his immediate supervision, yet the networks he had meticulously cultivated still pulsed with life, guided by the principles, culture, and loyalty he had instilled over years of disciplined leadership. In many ways, the environment outside became a mirror of the systems he had established, reflecting both his influence and the challenges that arose in his absence. Associates, forced to operate with increased autonomy, had to make decisions that once might have relied on his direct oversight, testing both their competence and their loyalty to the larger structure he had created. The management of this autonomy required subtle psychological reinforcement. McGriff recognized that trust alone was insufficient to maintain cohesion, it had to be reinforced through careful guidance, strategic oversight, and the continuous calibration of expectations. Instructions were conveyed through intermediaries. By integrating financial management with human oversight and operational coordination, McGriff preserved both the resilience and adaptability of the empire. Wealth continued to function not only as a means of material sustenance but as a tool of psychological influence, reinforcing loyalty, credibility, and authority. Territorial influence also required careful consideration. With McGriff physically absent, the management of neighborhoods, distribution points, and key locations relied on associates executing previously defined protocols. Observation and reporting systems allowed for the monitoring of activities, detection of rival incursions, and real-time adaptation to emerging challenges. The subtle projection of authority, maintained through reputation, selective communication, and strategic intervention, ensured that boundaries of influence remained respected. Even without direct oversight, McGriff's carefully cultivated perception of power allowed him to maintain a degree of psychological dominance that discouraged challenges and reinforced stability. The psychological dynamics of loyalty and morale within the network were equally critical. Associates faced increased pressure from both internal and external forces, testing their alignment and resilience. McGriff's strategic reinforcement of values, expectations, and operational norms mitigated the risk of fragmentation. Mentorship, guidance, and the controlled dissemination of influence ensured that competence was rewarded, initiative was channeled toward collective goals, and missteps were addressed discreetly. Through these mechanisms, he preserved both the operational integrity of the network and the cohesion of the social structure underpinning it, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of the interplay between human behavior and organizational stability. Law enforcement pressure continued to evolve, incorporating both traditional investigative methods and advanced surveillance techniques. McGriff's strategy adapted accordingly, integrating risk management, operational discretion, and the careful control of communication. By anticipating investigative focus, compartmentalizing sensitive activities, and maintaining strict protocols, the network remained resilient. Associates understood the heightened stakes, internalizing both procedural discipline and strategic awareness.